I would like to welcome everyone to the first Green Living class of 2021. The topic for tonight's class is an exciting one. It's on spring vegetable gardening in the low desert. So, of course, want to go over really quick. Oops, let me go back one slide. And so, of course, we want to go into some webinar logistics. Attendees are muted and the class will be recorded. The recording will be available on the city's water conservation website and YouTube channel in about a week. You can type your questions and comments in the Q&A or chat functions, and I will do my best to read and to respond to as many as I can throughout the webinar. The class is scheduled to be about 1.5 hours long. We have 1 hour allotted for the presentation and about 30 minutes for questions. We will aim to stay on track as we want to be respectful of your time. If you experience any significant technical difficulties, please contact Ann Staley via email or phone. Her email is astaley@glendaleaz.com. I'll spell that out just in case you're tuning in via phone. So that's spelled ASTAHLEY@glendaleaz.com, or you can call her at 623-930-3550. After this presentation, we'll follow up with an email that includes a copy of the PowerPoint, resources, a recording, and a link to the survey. And if you complete the survey, you will be entered to win a free gift card for Summer Winds Nursery. So a nice little carrot for this evening. So thanks again for tuning in. Of course, want to go over some Zoom attendee features. So this is what your screen might resemble. You can play around with the features so that you're comfortable. You can click and drag the vertical bar located in between the presenter and the presentation view, and that will help you enlarge or shrink the presentation view on your screen. You can also adjust the audio settings in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. And of course, feel free to send questions and comments using the Q&A button and chat button. I'll do my best to answer questions during the presentation as they come in, but we should have enough time for Charlie to answer questions at the end of his presentation. I do want to take some time to share a free resource with you all. You could actually take home free seeds at the Glendale Public Library Seed Library. So seeds are sourced from Native Seed Search and provided by the Glendale Water Services Department. We invite you to check out the Seed Library, which is offered at all 4 library locations. That includes the Glendale Main Library, Heroes Regional Park Library, Velma Teague Library, and Foothills Library. All library locations will be open from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Monday through Friday, and 12 to 5 p.m. on Saturdays. Seeds are available though on a first come, first served basis. We hope you'll drop by, and if you end up taking home some free seeds, feel free to tag us on social media to share your progress or send us an email. We'd love to hear how your gardening is going in your own yard. And I've included the link below if you wanted to learn more about the locations and the type of seeds and additional resources. And of course, this workshop wouldn't be possible without our friends at Watershed Management Group. And I'm very excited to introduce you to our presenter tonight. So Charlie Alcorn is a program coordinator for the Green Living Co-op at Watershed Management Group, where he coordinates the consultation and design program for residential water harvesting systems and manages projects installing rain tanks, gray water systems, and implementing earthworks at residential properties. Charlie graduated with a degree in physics from Dickinson College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. After working in communications and as an educator in environmental nonprofits in the United States and abroad, he continued his education and received a graduate certificate in water policy from the University of Arizona. His interests include empowering individuals with skills and information to help them improve their quality of life and to support a healthy environment. As a gardener, Charlie started greening his thumb at the campus farm at Dickinson College. Since then, he has volunteered at several community gardens in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and locally was an intern at the Tucson Village Farm in Tucson. Everyone, please help me welcome Charlie Alcorn.
Umane, thanks for that introduction. And first I want to say thanks to the City of Glendale and the Glendale Water Services Department. This is a fantastic series. I was checking out some of the classes that are scheduled and the presenters, and like, what a treat to have this series happening. So thank you very much for making this available to the community. And yeah, really excited for tonight. I'm gonna share my screen and we're gonna jump right into it. So as Umane mentioned, my name is Charlie Alcorn. I work with Watershed Management Group. We are a nonprofit organization based in Tucson, and we do community education and grassroots projects with the hope of influencing policy and decision makers. Our mission is to support a healthy community and then also a healthy watershed. And tonight it is all about vegetable gardening in the low desert. I'm an enthusiastic gardener. I'd say what I lack in knowledge, I make up for in enthusiasm and curiosity, because I think gardening in general, it's a lifelong hobby and passion. And so really happy and excited to share what I know with everyone. Tonight, what I'm going to be talking about is, first we're going to be looking at site planning and prep. So before we even have seeds that we're putting in the ground, how do we make sure we create a happy future home for our future plants? Next, I'm going to touch on our growing seasons and share some species that are good to grow during certain times of the year. And then after that, I'm going to share some tips for success of how to be a little bit more of a green gardener. And also I'm going to turn to the Sonoran Desert to find some inspiration on growing food, because we already live in a rich and abundant place for supporting people and as well as animals. Right now we're all sharing this virtual space. I think we're all coming in as gardeners or future gardeners. We have different knowledge backgrounds. I think at last I looked, it was like 40 people in this classroom. So that's 40 different sources of knowledge and background. So I encourage everyone to ask questions in the chat. Umane mentioned how to use the chat feature, so I really encourage you to ask questions there. And then also, if you feel like you have an answer or a unique perspective on some of the questions that show up, feel free to chime in and share what your experience has been. And to get us a little familiar with the chat feature, I've got a question for everyone that I'd love to see some answers to. And that is, what are some challenges you think of when you think of gardening in the desert in our climate? And maybe if you're from a different part of the country, that could be, what are some differences? Or just, if you've gardened here before, what has been a challenge for you? Or what do you think could be a challenge? And I'm gonna find our chat feature here. There we go. Okay, I see heat, soil mixture, pests, some worries about water, aphids, more pests, soil moisture, ooh, caliche, yes. Just the heat in the desert soil. Okay, yeah, and we have some people that are familiar with gardening in different parts of the country and have landed in the Southwest and are seeing the joys and challenges of gardening here. So thank you everyone for sharing that. And I thought of a few that came to my mind that I have. There we go, right there. And it matches a lot of what you shared. I thought about soil quality, caliche, and anyone that's not familiar with caliche, it is a soil layer that we'll find in some areas that is just extremely compact and dense, and it makes it really hard for our vegetables to set their roots deeper once they hit that caliche surface. Also, we have pests and dry climate. We are in a hot place. So I like to point these challenges out because I'd say successful gardener, it's like, look at what your challenges are and then find ways to work with those challenges and adapt to those challenges. And hopefully I'll share some things tonight that will help us do that. First, looking at site planning. Some of these things I'm going to, so these bullets here, talking about sun exposure and shade, I'm going to dig into that some. I'm going to share some about soil and good soils to use, and talk some about the soil quality we have here, our native soil in the Sonoran Desert. I'm going to touch some on access to water. But really, before you, dive into gardening, I think a great question to ask yourself is, how much food do you need to grow? And I say that with a really clear image of last summer in my backyard, my roommate growing 8 eggplants and 6 basil plants. And as much as we really loved the eggplant and basil, I think after a few weeks we were eggplanted out and had enough pesto. And so some of those fruits, or some of those veggies, some of it went to waste. So I encourage you to think, are you trying to provide food for just yourself or like a small family? Think about how much you need to produce. And I encourage you to have a backup plan. Maybe find a neighbor, a friend that would be excited to take some of the vegetables that you grow if you have an overabundance and don't need them. I think vegetable gardening, we put so much love and care into our veggies. We put so many resources into those. They deserve to be enjoyed by someone. So just something to think about when you're first starting off. And so Watershed Management Group, we're very big on water harvesting. And so I'm going to sneak a few little elements of water harvesting and also kind of like permaculture design into this presentation. And this is kind of really helpful for anyone that is a new homeowner or is just starting the journey, adventure into gardening and working in your yard. What we have here is an aerial view of a property. And I got this off of, I think, Google Maps. You can take a little screenshot of your property, but really you can keep it very simple. Take a piece of paper and draw your property lines, or a general shape for your property lines. This one here, we have a rectangle, and then draw the permanent structures on your property. Here we got the house, and you don't have to take measurements of your roof. Just giving a general outline of what your roof kind of shape is. In this image here, we also have the shed or some kind of other permanent structure in this bottom right. And then draw out kind of the areas where you have a lot of shade. So on this property, we have a big tree. And this is, if you notice in the bottom right, there's an arrow pointing with the letter N, that's for north. So we have the top part of this page is the northern part of the property, and the bottom part of the page is the southern part of the property. So you draw out kind of the places where you already have very shady places. And yeah, think about, okay, which side of my house is the northern side and what side's the part is the south. So kind of, if you have a piece of paper, you can do that. And I encourage you to draw something out. Keep it rudimentary if you want. And you can take notes on that and think about, really this is now a canvas for you to play around on and think about, okay, maybe I want to create a garden bed in the southern part of my property here, right next to my house. Oh, but I know at some point I want to plant a really nice shade tree in another part of my house. So it just is a great spot for you to play around with ideas and think about, 1 month down the line, 1 year down the line, what do you want your landscape to look like? Here we have an image. So this image is from Brad Lancaster's Rainwater Harvesting for Drylands and Beyond book. It's a book very focused on water harvesting, but he talks about a lot of other kind of site planning elements. And here he has what I just shared with you. We have a property, aerial view of a property. And in this image, he's laying out and thinking about what are the hot parts of his property. In general, in Glendale, in southern Arizona, in the USA, the southern exposure of, or the southern part of our property is the part that's getting the most direct sunlight. And so it's going to be the place where your plants will benefit the most from solar exposure. But with that wonderful sunlight to help the plants photosynthesize comes a lot of heat, a lot of intense sun rays and a lot of heat. So if you're drawing your kind of site map or working with your drawing for the aerial view, draw out where are the places that are going to be hot. We know the southern exposure, the southern part of your property is going to be where there's more heat building up. Places where there's shade, maybe you're not going to see as much heat. In general, Brad in this image here notes that the northern part of the property is cold in the winter. I think, hot and cold, they're relative terms. I'd say it's a cool part of your house in the winter time. And that is partially because of the shade that you'll have in the northern part of your house in the winter. So start to think about those spaces of where's the really hot parts of your yard and what are the parts of your yard that are a little cooler. And, on kind of complementing that is what are the parts that are really sunny and what are the parts that are getting shade a lot of the day. And yeah. So, and with that, you want to make sure that your plant is getting the sun exposure that it wants. So not all plants want to be in the sunniest, hottest part of your yard. And a way to know how much sun your plant wants is a lot of times when you purchase seeds or when you get seeds, you can look and see if the plant, it's suggested that the plant gets full sun, partial shade, or full shade. And full sun, generally you're looking at like the plant is happy getting 6 to 8 hours of sunlight during the day. In partial sun, you're looking at like 4 to 6 hours of sunlight during the day. Partial shade and full shade, that really means that those plants, they have a hard time with the direct sunlight. So there's different ways you can shade your garden spaces, but plants that like partial shade and full shade, they're happy getting the warmth from the sun. They're probably happy getting some of the sunlight, but they need a little reprieve and a little bit of a time away from this direct rays. And even in the desert, since we have such a strong sun, plants that are identified as full sun or partial sun, sometimes they need as well some sun covering just to like protect them from those really intense times a day where the sun is really blazing down. And to give a little image of that, I have two different solar paths that the sun will follow. On the right side here, we have the sun's path during the longest day of the year. And a thing that I didn't know until not too long ago was that in the summertime, the sun is actually rising north of east. And it's rising and rising and getting to a really high point in the sky at around noon. And then when it's setting, it's falling and it's setting north of west. And just to note, both of these solar paths, these are specific to our region. So this is specific to Glendale and Tucson, Phoenix. This is how the sun travels through our sky in this part of the world. And then that is in comparison to our winter sun, which is rising actually south of east and spending less time in the sky. It's not rising quite as high as our summer sun. So what that means is when you're looking at the horizon, the southern horizon in your yard during noon in the summer, you have to look up pretty high to look straight in the sun. Not a recommended thing unless you're wearing sunglasses, but the sun is just higher in the higher angle in the horizon versus the winter time. The sun is lower on the horizon, so you don't have to look up quite as high. And where this kind of factors in is with shading. In the summertime, you can have some garden beds on the northern part of your property, and they'll probably get some sunlight as long as you don't have the front part of your property providing shade. Versus the winter time, it's likely that even at noon, even when the sun is highest in the sky, your house might be shading out any places that you'd be wanting to grow some veggies. So a few things to consider when placing your plants. As I mentioned, plants, as much as they love the sun, sometimes they just need a break from it and want to get some shade. Here are a few examples of different shade structures you can work with. What we have here on the image on the left, or with the image on the left, both of these are community gardens in our region. And the image on the left, this image is facing south. So we're looking south, directly south right now. And this structure is called a trellis, and it has a shade cloth over top of it. And if you think about, so if you're following my cursor, we have the sun rising on the east side. And right when the sun is at its highest, so when it's kind of really blazing down and providing the strongest, most intense solar rays, that's when these plants, these right here under the trellis, that's when they're getting the shade, because maybe they're enjoying the sun rising and getting some of the direct light from the sun then, but when the sun is hottest and most intense, they need a little break. The shade cloth is not, as we can see right through it, it's not blocking out all the sunlight, it's just reducing the intensity a little bit. And then as the sun sets in the west, probably it's getting a little bit of direct sunlight as the sun moves through the sky. On the right side here, again, in the picture, we're facing north, like very close to facing north. And you see a few different types of shade cloth. So this dark covering here on these garden beds, that is shade cloth. We have shade cloth going up this garden bed as well. And it's probably serving two purposes, because these were pictures taken in the wintertime. They're providing some shade, but also they might be helping keep some of the heat in the garden bed in the evenings. But the thing, the reason I took this picture is because, again, so yeah, we're facing north. So we have the sun rising on the east side, and these trees right here, these are on the west side of the garden. And so the sun passes through the sky, and these trees start to provide some shade to these garden beds here towards the end of the day. And the reason being is that the plants, the sun rises in the morning, they're getting their sun rays, they can handle, they are exposed to the intense afternoon sun, but then they just can't, maybe they can't take it anymore. They need a little bit of a reprieve earlier than what would naturally happen with just the sun setting in the horizon. So we have these trees providing some western shade as the sun is dropping. So those are two kind of like planned out, a man-made structure here with the trellis. We have some shade cloth here, so also man-made. So a little bit of planning ahead with planting around these shading trees. Well, we also see this happen in the environment. I think everyone can probably feel connected with where this camel here during the hottest times of the year. If you ever have had to wait for a bus or spend any time outside, I think we all gravitate towards the shade, because that shade is providing a microclimate, that tree is providing a microclimate with its shade. A thing we see happen in the environment is on the right side here, we have a Palo Verde tree, and underneath that Palo Verde tree, we have a saguaro cactus. And what the Palo Verde tree is actually acting as what we call a nurse plant. So it's providing shade to this cactus during the day, during the really hot times of the summer. But thinking about this year round, this tree is also providing some protection from windy days. It's providing some protection from maybe the colder nights where the cactus doesn't want to be around the freezing temperatures. And then in addition to that, the Palo Verde tree is dropping twigs, organic matter onto the soil, and the saguaro cactus is benefiting from that organic matter, those nutrients falling on the soil. So we want to kind of mimic this beneficial relationship as much as we can when planting. And it's a little, over time, you can find more and more ways to do it. I think as beginning gardeners, this is kind of a pie and like a goal to have is these like mutually beneficial systems in our garden. But I just wanted to share a little example of it so we can start to look at ways to mimic these types of relationships. So once you've decided maybe a spot in your yard that's getting some western shade or somewhere that's getting enough sunlight for the plants that you want to grow, the next thing to think about is where do you want your plants' roots to set? And we have two pictures on the left side. These are of planting containers. And so we have a trough that is holding some winter greens, and then a rain barrel, a 55-gallon drum that's holding, I guess, some collards, it looks like. So the pros of planting in a container is that first, right off the bat, you get to pick the soil the plants are growing in. So you get to pick the quality, the texture, how much, the nutrients. Another thing is you get to pick the place where that container is sitting. So you get to place it in whatever part of the yard is you think most beneficial. And then thinking about just all the different types of gardeners we have, a planting container is bringing the garden up towards you. So if you're thinking about straining your knees and hurting your back as you're gardening, planting containers are a really great thing because you're not bending quite far towards the ground to do your gardening, your soil amending, your harvesting. Some cons for planting in containers is you're going to need to up the amount of irrigation you're providing it, up the amount of water that you're putting towards supporting these plants. And the reason being is because in this container here, we have this whole kind of siding around this trough here. It's getting hit by the sun's rays. It's heating up during the day and feeling solar exposure, which is increasing the temperature of the soils and increasing the amount of evaporation that's happening out of the soils. The same thing is happening here with the 55-gallon barrel. A cool thing that I want to point out about the 55-gallon barrel is if you're limited on space, notice that this barrel is not just growing, outwards. The barrel is growing upwards. So we're maximizing our footprint of our growing space by growing vertically and not just from side to side. Another con to container gardening is that it's just a larger upfront cost. You have to purchase the container, and then also you definitely have to purchase all the soil that you're going to put into that container. A few notes about soil, especially in these containers, is your plants are looking to have at least 18 inches of rich soil for them to grow in. That is so that their roots can grow deep and happy so that they can search for water in the soil. You want to plan for good drainage in your planting containers. So that starts with soil drainage for your soil, but also a thing to think about is if you have a more shallow container, maybe plan to have a few holes in the bottom of the container to let the water that's at the bottom of the container drain out. And the reason being is if you end up overwatering your containers, you can pretty much fill up all the little spots in your soil that have air that the roots want to use to absorb nutrients. That oxygen is going to be filled up with water, and you're creating what they call an anaerobic environment, so an environment that has no oxygen, and the roots are not happy in that environment. So making sure there's always kind of an escape plan for the water in your more shallow containers so that the roots aren't just sitting in moisture is really important. And then a little pro tip, cover your soil between growing seasons. So after you've had your awesome harvest from one of your containers, think about covering it with 2 inches of compost, putting a mulch cover over it. And what that does is just helps keep the living the living environment in your soils active, and it doesn't give them time to, kind of lose their vigorousness and die off. You can also look at planting cover crops in your planting containers. I don't have any recommendations for cover crops. I think there's, depending on kind of like what balance you want to bring back to your soil for nutrients, there's a lot of different options. But definitely working with compost and mulch cover, that just brings organics back into the container. In general, you want to do that 2 weeks before, 2 weeks before you plant your new kind of new season's vegetables. You definitely want to put compost in then, but really like after you harvest, put some organics in there and let them start to break down and kind of build the nutrients back up in your soil. Another option of where to set your roots is our good old garden beds. Some benefits to garden beds: we have better soil or moisture retention in the soil. Also, you can start to sneak in some water harvesting principles. So, and I'll touch on that in a little bit, but some of the principles of how do you make more use of the rainwater that we are so happy to get in this desert. And then also just in general, you're not paying for the cost of the container, so it's potentially a lower upfront cost. Some cons for working in the garden beds. So anyone who's worried about bending over and kind of body strain, you're having to get down low to do your harvesting and your soil amending. But the really big thing is that you have to amend your desert soils. Our native soils are not meant to be growing our most vegetables that we're wanting to harvest. It is a great soil for native plants, but if you're wanting to grow a lot of the vegetables we love, you have to amend your desert soil. Another thing that I pointed out or mentioned earlier is caliche. When you're planting your garden bed, I recommend digging down 6 inches to 10 inches, maybe 12 inches below your soil level to make sure you're not running into caliche, because it'd be such a sad thing to put the time into putting in compost and amending the soil just to find out that 6 inches below the soil surface, you're hitting some caliche. That's really going to make it hard for the root systems to develop and grow deep where they want to grow. A thing you can do if you're finding that you have caliche all over your property, a thing you can do is create what they call a raised bed. So that's just building kind of like the outline of a box using either wood or different materials. And you want to build that up to be maybe 6 inches, 10 inches, 12 inches above the actual soil surface. And then you fill that, that raised area with soils, compost, different, nutrient-rich soils. And what that does is just, if you're having that caliche layer that's maybe 6 inches below the soil, well, it raises the amount of space that your roots can grow into and kind of benefit from. So, and then also it brings your garden a little bit closer to you, which makes, easier working. A few things about our desert soils, our native soils: they're generally an more alkaline soil. And I think a lot of vegetables, they like to grow in more like basic or acidic soils. But the alkalinity of our soil, it is the source of a lot of nutrient issues. So that is another reason to plant. Always make sure you're planting organic materials in your native soils and mixing it in. Like a lot of nutrient issues, you can put tons of fertilizer and tons of soil amendments into your garden once your plants are growing. But if you make the effort to give your garden bed a rich compost, a rich soil to grow in from the start, you're going to be avoiding some of the headaches and some of the need to troubleshoot and try and figure out what's the deficiency, because it's the alkalinity that it kind of holds on to some of the nutrients that your plants want. So it's just that the roots don't have access to what they want when you have really alkaline soils. So yes, I'm going on a little bit about make sure you're putting in organic materials and mixing it in pretty deep to your garden beds. People look to use manure as well in their garden beds as like a soil amendment, like in preparing your beds, and that is fine. A few things about that. It's highly recommended to wait at least 3 months for the manure to kind of break down. The reason being, manure is high in salts and it has some ammonia in it. And so you want some of those salts to leach out of the manure before you put it in your garden bed, because you don't want a salty garden bed. That's really not a good environment for your veggies to grow. And then, yeah, having the ammonia leach out as well. So at least 3 months for the manure to break down before you mix it into your soil. I think the longer, probably the better in that scenario. And again, dig deep, look for that caliche before you create your future plant's home. And okay, another chance to use the chat feature. So this, what we have here is what we call a lowered garden bed. And we have some greens growing here. We have this looks like a vining squash, I think. And shock, this garden bed is not irrigated with potable water. So what I'd love to see is, where do people think this garden bed is getting the water to support all these green, happy growing plants? So use the chat and try and point out some of the sources of water this garden bed is growing from. I'm going to pull up the chat here. I like it. First two comments, we have a rain barrel, we have a cistern. Anyone else think they spot stuff? We got water hose. So that's this, probably they're seeing this black hose right here. We got rain barrel, drip system, black water. So these are all great things to point out. So yeah, kind of the I'll say elephant in the room, elephant in the picture, in this case a rain tank in the picture. This rain tank is collecting water from the roof of this homeowner's property and storing that rainwater for use in providing water to this vegetable garden here. So that's what this irrigation system is this irrigation system is set up to a timer, which is opening and closing the valve to this rain barrel to provide water to the garden. But a few things, and it's a little bit hard to see in this picture, but this is a sunken bed and it's at a low point in the property. So when it rains, and all along the property, since this is a low point, slowly the rain that's falling on the soils and on the rocks here, everywhere that's a higher point in the property, all that is slowly moving towards this lowered bed to benefit these veggies. Another thing we have is, this is a mighty big rain tank, but what we see with this green pipe here is this is what we call an overflow. So once this tank gets filled up and can't hold any more water, that water overflows into this tube, and we can see the outlet for that tube right at the top of where this lowered bed is. So that water is flowing, overflowing over the tank, or out of the tank, and then into this lowered bed. So just a little bit of creative inspiration for you is, when you're picking out your garden bed, if you have a lot of spaces and options, look at where are the load points on your property. Can you put a garden bed there? If you do, there's mutual benefits. There are a lot of benefits that those veggies will get from being in a garden bed and in that sunken area, the low point on your property. Oh, and another benefit to planting in this kind of lowered garden bed is that these plants are a little bit, in the times of year that are a little bit windier, these are getting some protection from that wind, which is reducing the amount of evaporation that's happening, and also just providing some shelter to these little veggies. Yeah. There we go. So to move on, we're going to talk a little bit about seasons and species. And to start, we have two growing seasons in the Southwest. We have our cool season, which runs from September to December, and we have our warm season that runs from January to August. And within those seasons, you can actually break it up into shoulders, or break into shoulder seasons, where there's a shoulder season in the early spring and also a shoulder season in the early fall. And so when looking at these shoulder seasons, you can maybe start some of the veggies that you're going to grow that need a longer time to mature and grow and fruit. You can start some of the varieties during that shoulder season. Another thing you can do is, if there's some veggies that are growing kind of faster and grow to maturity quicker, you could maybe grow really early on in that shoulder season and have another round of harvest of certain crops or varieties within that shoulder season. Here I have a picture of a planting calendar. This one is from Native Seed Search, and planting calendars in general, there are so many different types of planting calendars. I was checking out the calendar for Maricopa County, and I really like that calendar. That's a great resource to look at. I like it because it breaks down when to plant with just a seed, if you're planting from seed, or if you're going out and getting starts or sprouting things in your house or a greenhouse, and planting the little starts, the little mini veggies. It gives you recommendations on when to plant with those too. So I'd recommend find a calendar that you connect with. Absolutely make sure you're using a growing calendar or planting calendar that's specific to our region, so the low desert. Yeah, this one from Native Seed Search, it's colorful. It kind of breaks things down by month windows. And a neat thing to notice is that in the fall, this calendar cuts off in mid-November and doesn't start up until mid-January. The reason being that after mid-November and until mid-January, we're looking at that time of year to be the time where we might have some freezing temperatures, and that is really not a great environment for starting our veggies. It makes it very hard and maybe too stressful for starting new plants. So it's a good time to take a break, or enjoy your bountiful harvests or your bountiful growing from the late fall. So again, find a calendar that you connect with and make sure that it's local to our region. So a few cool plant terms. We have what we call annual species and perennial species. An annual species, that is a lot of the vegetables or the plants that we use in our vegetable gardens. Those are annual species. Their life cycle is a year or less. Most of the time when we're gardening, it's really a season. And then you'll find that at the end of that season, you're either, harvesting your plant and you're just pulling it out of the ground, or that plant will eventually die off and most likely go to seed, or what we call bolt, in order to reproduce or spread their the future generations of their future lineage. So annuals, and you can kind of stretch the window that these annual species grow, but in general, it's a season, possibly longer than a season if you support an environment that they're happy growing in. And then perennial species, think about the trees that we have that are, producing seasonally. They're not producing year round, but their life cycle is lasting year after year. So our lemon trees, our fig trees, stuff like that. So yeah, just two terms that we can work with. In general, when thinking about seeds, we have your store-bought generic seeds. They're cheap, they're easy to find. They're gonna help you accomplish your goal, which is probably to grow healthy food, to enjoy gardening. So store-bought seeds at your big stores will help you, they're gonna let you garden. I encourage you to kind of dial more to the desert adapted varieties. Native Seed Search, their name keeps on coming up. They do great things They have a seed catalog that has a lot of varieties of seeds specific to our region. And that's just important because if you're planting things that have adapted to our climate, you're more likely to succeed. A lot of times these seeds are also more culturally significant in our region. It's a more ecologically sustainable and responsible thing to do. If you do end up doing the generic store-bought seeds, you might not always be getting the freshest seed. And so a lot of times on seed packets, they'll give you a recommendation of how many seeds to put in each little spot you're planting. And you might just want to throw in a little bit of extra seed into each of the places you're planting, because with less fresh seeds, you're not going to see quite the survival rate as you might with fresher seeds. And then if you end up with way too many, a bunch of little sprouts coming up in the same space, you can do what we call thinning and just find new home, very gently kind of pull the starts apart and find new homes for them to grow. So yeah, encourage you to do desert adapted varieties for a lot of reasons, but generic store-bought is going to get us to where we want to be probably at the end of the day. So now it is time to brag about our cool season crops. And brag is a little acronym. To start us off, we have the brassicas. So this is the mustard family. Broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cauliflower, kale kohlrabi. These varieties, they really like to grow in a rich soil. They're a cool season crop, so they're not too fond of the very hot times of year. There are some varieties of, I know, cabbage, collards, that will tolerate some of the warmer times of year. So you can find exceptions or things that are adapted to maybe not handle the hottest times of the summer, but kind of creep into those warmer months. Brassicas, yeah, rich soils. They like good draining soils. And I think this goes for all of our winter crops. In general, winter crops are a little bit easier for a beginning gardener. And that is because they're a little bit more hardy plants in general than compared to some of the summer species I'm going to talk about. And then also, it's just a little bit of an easier time to grow. I think it's winter, or the cooler seasons, is a little bit of an easier time for all of us. And that goes for our winter crops as well. There's fewer pests to be concerned about. I think irrigation and watering isn't such I'll say, a crisis or an emergency or a concern. They do need still regular watering, but it's just a little bit of an easier place to play around with if you're a new gardener. Then we move on to the roots. We have carrots, radishes, parsnips, beets, turnips. I didn't mention potatoes. They grow in the ground. They're a part of the nightshade family. A little tangent about potatoes. I find that they're kind of I found a little bit of a harder plant to grow. They just like a specific soil quality. And so didn't mention them. In general, your rooting vegetables, they're not as hungry for the really nutrient dense soils. What they want is a lighter soil, something that's a little easier to grow in. I've heard of people putting a little bit of a sand mixture into the soil where they're growing root vegetables, and that's just to create a little bit of an easier environment for your root veggies to spread out and get bigger in the soil. If you do end up putting a lot of nutrients in those soils, what you might end up with is very leaf-rich and green carrot tops and parsnip tops and beet greens. And that is not, so you'll have the big leafy tops, and then when you pull the actual root part that you're excited to eat out of the ground, you're going to have kind of a smaller harvest. And that's because they don't really want the really high intense nutrient soil. So all is not lost if you do have a small harvest of your root veggies. Everything I have listed here is something you can cook with the green part of the vegetable, so the leafy part of the vegetable. I've had a carrot top pesto that has an interesting texture, but it's really tasty. So even with slip up, you can find some inspiration in the kitchen then of how to make use of the very green root vegetables you might end up with. And yeah, another thing is, because these like a different soil quality than the brassicas that I talked about that like the more nutrient rich soil, a thing you can start to think about doing when planting your garden is trying to match plants that like similar conditions, whether that's like exposure to sun or soil quality, planting them in the same area so that you're kind of creating a similar environment where all the root, in this case, the root vegetables are going to be growing happy together and healthily. Moving on, we have alliums, onions and garlic. Shallots are just little onions. So again, they're a cool season crop. I think a cool thing about onions, I definitely search for varieties that are desert adapted or able to tolerate our climate. There are bunching onions that are kind of a cool feature to your garden. They are not just a one-time yank out the whole plant and then as a harvest and then eat it. You can grow bunching onions and yank out a clump of them, harvest some of them, and then put the clump back in the ground, and they'll keep on sprouting and being active. I've seen with the bunching onions, the bunching onions, they can also tolerate some shade, and so it's having them in shade, it slows down their growing, their like rate of growth a little bit, but maybe it'll help extend their life into the next season a little bit. So yeah, just something to play around with. Look for varieties that are adapted to our climate. And yeah, bunching onions, they're pretty neat. Nice way to extend your onion harvest so that you're not yanking out all your onions at the same time and then have to make onion soup or something. Lots of onion soup. We have our greens next, our lettuce, spinach, arugula, and chard. Again, these really like nutrient-rich soils. A thing you can do, I'll mention this probably a few more times in the class, but really encourage you to create a rich growing environment before you put seeds in the ground. So like prepare the soils to keep your plants happy from the start. But if you're looking to use some fertilizer or want to mix in some fertilizers while you're growing, you can, once the greens have grown their second pair of leaves, you can use a liquid fertilizer to help kind of encourage them and bring more nutrients into the soil. Compost tea is an example of a liquid nutrient or a liquid fertilizer. So that is something to play with. And yeah, that's after they grow their second pair of leaves. A fun thing about greens is they can grow into the colder months, and actually greens can withstand some frost. And so people say that a green that's been like kind of kissed by frost is a little bit sweeter. And you might notice that if they have been exposed to frost, that they have a little bit of damage to them. It's really an aesthetic thing. It's not going to hurt their flavor. I think if they get exposed to frost time after time after time, it might start to affect their flavor. But push it into your cold season, push into growing your greens and continuing to harvest them even after frost, because you might notice they're a little sweeter after that. And then outside of the brag, we have herbs. And herbs are, a lot of them are cool season crops. I really like to grow my herbs inside. Big reason being I forget to harvest them if I have them in my backyard, but if I have them on my windowsill in my kitchen, which I'm fortunate enough to have enough sunlight during the day for them to enjoy that, I can harvest them right away. I can harvest them while I'm cooking, and I look at them and I remember, okay, I have a lot of parsley that I need to do something with, or a lot of cilantro that I need to do something with, and take some inspiration from the veggies or the herbs that are growing in my kitchen. This is another example of you can grow herbs in a little bit more of a shady area, and they'll grow slower. They're not, going to grow quite as abundantly, but they'll grow slower. They'll tolerate it, and you can maybe keep on harvesting them a little bit longer into the growing season. Some common issues that we run into in the cooler seasons is frost, and as I mentioned, frost really it's an aesthetic thing, and if you don't like the kind of wilted leaves, you can peel off a few, the frost damaged leaves, you can peel off, compost them, and then just eat the leaves that haven't wilted. And also look at playing around with some of the coverings for insulation. If you know a frost is coming and you are concerned, maybe create some covers for your winter greens. And that goes, just coming to mind, but I won't go too deep into it, but that also goes for your trees, your citrus trees and things like that. A lot of our perennials will really be, especially in the desert, things that are able to grow, the perennials and citrus trees that people grow, they're really happy having a little bit of protection either over their roots or along their trunk to protect them from those cool, really, and maybe even frosty nights. A thing we'll run into once the plant recognizes that it's going to be a not so comfortable future, and that meaning the temperature and the seasons are changing, is the plant will go to flower and then go to bolt, which means that the plant's going to go to seed. You'll see that the plants, once they start to go to seed and bolt, you might notice that the flavor changes some. It's not going to, maybe it'll be a little bit more tart, or some of them get a little bit more spicy, the greens that are on the spicier side. So yeah, you lose some of the flavor quality as the plants go to bolt, but really what's happening is the plants are saying, hey, I need to focus my energy on flowering, producing seeds so that I can spread that seed and support future generations. And not all is lost when your veggies go to bolt. Here we have bolting cilantro. And anyone that doesn't know, cilantro, wonderful spice to grow and harvest, but when it goes to bolt, it becomes, or the seeds are a wonderful spice to incorporate into your kitchen. It's the coriander seed. So yeah, if you can look to harvest cilantro and use that in your cooking, and then once it goes to bolt, harvest some of those seeds, crush them up, and bring them to your spice cabinet, and also collect some of those seeds and hold on to them for the next growing season. So I know we're all muted right now. Everyone give a little shakeout. That I'm going through things pretty quickly. This is a lot of information. And if you saw a veggie, a cool season crop that you're excited to grow, I want you to say, kale yeah, and just shout it out. I know I can't hear you, but get some blood flowing. Stay a little active here and engaged. Okay, so warm season crops. Let's dive in. To start, the pepper. I mean, there are so many varieties of peppers. It is amazing. Variety that is native to our desert is the chiltepin pepper. It is a wonderful spice, pretty hot, but I'd say really tasty. So that is definitely a pepper that you'll see, well, we see it growing naturally out in the desert, but it's something that will probably do well in your garden. If you give it the right conditions, it is a perennial plant, or perennial. So you can plant it in the right spot. I've had some friends grow it in pots, and basically it's not going to produce all year round, but as long as you care for it throughout the year, when it'll produce seasonally. I forget what time of year they do. I think it's in the springtime is when they flower and produce. So, and every spring you can look forward to harvesting your chiltepins. And you can ferment those and make a really great kind of like, I don't know, sriracha sauce. Other things interesting about peppers are if you're planting different varieties of peppers in the same garden, be careful of putting different varieties right next to each other. The reason being is if you plant a hot pepper next to a sweet pepper, those plants will cross-pollinate and you'll end up with two hot peppers. So you want to separate your different varieties of peppers just a little bit so they don't end up cross-pollinating. You'll hear me say this a few more times. Look for varieties that are adapted to our climate. Look for ones that are happier in the, can handle the heat. Probably you'll still need to give them some shade cover or some, consider, shading them during certain times of the day. They are happy in rich soils and soils that are well draining. And then if you're looking to do some fertilizing as they're growing, this is another plant, and I'd say all the fruiting plants that I'm going to be talking about, or sorry, flowering plants that I'm going to be talking about, all of them you can fertilize with a liquid fertilizer after the second, again, when the second pair of leaves arrive, but also you can fertilize them once they start to flower just to support their growth. Now tomatoes, again, a huge mix of varieties. Look for ones that are desert adapted. Look for ones that have grown here for generations. You can choose to grow tomatoes or in a few different ways. I've seen people grow them as kind of, or there's vining tomatoes. So you can set up a trellis for vining tomatoes so that essentially the tomatoes grow as, into the trellis and as this big viney wall along the trellis. In my garden, what I've done, I don't have the vining tomatoes, but these plants really grow pretty bushy and big. And what I've done is I'll put a stake in the ground. I've used bamboo. You put a stick of bamboo in the ground, make sure that it's not, easy to knock it over. And then you start to tie a string or some kind of make a little attachment so that the tomato is being supported by the stake in the ground. And that just really helps support the plant. They do kind of get, I don't know, too tall for their, I don't want to say too tall for their own good, but they would enjoy the support from the stakes in the ground as they get taller and bushier. Another thing about tomatoes, they are heat sensitive. Last summer, we had a crazy stretch of very hot days, temps over 100 degrees. And if you were unfortunate, if you're a tomato grower, maybe you can relate to this, but in my garden, all of my tomatoes flowered during that little period of time where it was over 100 for like a long time. And the pollen inside those flowers, once it's over like 95 degrees, if they're flowering, the pollen inside the flowers, it basically becomes infertile and not useful, and the flowers just fall off and you have no tomatoes. So a way to avoid that would be to try and start your seeds early or get starters in the ground and support your tomato growth earlier on in the season. So, even thinking about that, if you're starting from seed, thinking about this right as our winter or frosts are ending, or if you can start them from seed inside, that's a great option, but try and set this up so that your tomatoes aren't flowering at the same time as it's 100 degrees outside, because that's when you start to not see the like plentiful bounty of tomatoes, is when they're flowering during those hot times of year. Yeah, that's what I got to say about tomatoes. If you find yourself struggling with tomatoes, there is the tomatillo, which is it's a cousin of the tomato, I'll say. It's native adapted, so it's something that is grown here in our dry climate. It's a great kind of addition to a salsa, or great for making a salsa out of. And yeah, if you're struggling with tomatoes and want to work with a plant that's maybe a little bit more adapted already to our climate, check out trying to grow some tomatillos. They are really tasty. Next, we have eggplants. And again, this is a flowering veggie. The types I've heard do well in the desert, and there's several varieties, but I know that the Japanese eggplant is a good variety to grow in the desert. And for the eggplants and a few other plants I'm going to point out next, these flower, and the flowers are quite large. And if your vegetable garden is new or you don't see a lot of pollinators around your garden, what you can do to encourage encourage the pollination on these plants is you can take a little Q-tip and rub the inside of each of the flowers, just collecting a little bit of pollen, and touch each of the flowers. So that is hand fertilizing the eggplants, just to make sure that the pollen is spreading, and that you'll get to see things fruiting. Again, these are ones that once they start to flower, you can look to add a liquid fertilizer to them. And yeah, look for, again, ones that can tolerate our heat. And as for growing them, I've read that once they start to become shiny is the time to harvest them. I've harvested them probably all time. I think they've been, I didn't know that before when I was harvesting eggplants, so I couldn't really say what I was doing, but they turned out okay. So there's my anecdote for that. And then we're on to cucurbits. That's cucumbers, melons, squash, summer squash, and winter squash. Again, these are plants that have larger flowers, and if you're concerned about maybe some of the pollinators in your yard not quite making it to the center of the flower or not making it to all the flowers and spreading the pollen, you can take Q-tips and hand pollinate these as well. Cucurbits really, in general, they enjoy rich soil. They enjoy well-draining soil. They like warmer soils, so they're not, and that's kind of the big part of our summer crops is they're not going to germinate the seeds for our summer crops until the soil temperature reaches a certain temperature. And then the seeds are kind of more comfortable, they germinate, and they start to grow veggies. And that's what we see with the cucurbits, is they like those warmer soils. Interesting thing about cucumbers, they are more of a viney plant, and you can grow them on a trellis. To think about starting to maybe stack functions. Maybe you grow your cucumbers on the west side of your little garden plot, and that trellis, and provide a trellis, let them grow up the trellis, and then you're providing some natural, or you're building in some shade into your garden just by having your cucumbers grow up that trellis. So a little creative inspiration. Some common issues we run into for our summer crops is, the sun and water. It's such a hot time of year that water is always something that you should be thinking about, the soil moisture and consistently watering your plants. The sun, again, think about shading your garden plots during, either when the sun is the most intense in the afternoon, or giving it a little bit of early evening reprieve and shading on the west side. As for troubleshooting some plant stressors, you can look to the leaves at times to try and determine what exactly is going on. A general rule of thumb is that a brown center might hint that this plant is getting sunburnt, and that is those intense summer sun rays are stressing the plant, and so it needs a little bit of shade cloth to help protect it. A brown margin could relate to a nutrient issue, and again, if you didn't fully dive into putting organic material, nutrient material into your desert soils, you might be, maybe they're a little bit alkaline and they're holding on to the nutrients. It's hard to troubleshoot nutrient issues, at least like what nutrient is missing for the most part. But yeah, browning margin on the leaves might hint that there's a nutrient issue. Yellowing, you might see that there's a watering issue. And I think because people are so aware of how much water we need to support our veggie gardens in the desert, you'll run into people that overwater their plants, and a lot of times the yellowing means that you're overwatering your plants. Generally, when you're underwatering, the leaves will start to wilt and they'll look kind of droopy. So yellowing can suggest that you're overwatering. And then if you're noticing that your flowering vegetables are growing ginormous leaves and not really producing the amount of fruits or the size fruits you want, it could be related to a nitrogen excess or a deficiency. Yeah, something to consider. It's really hard, again, to kind of troubleshoot some of the nutrient issues around vegetable gardening, but that's a, one idea or one place to check if you're having very green fruiting vegetables, bushy rooting vegetables. Moving to pests, yeah, first start is pick varieties of veggies that aren't known to have a lot of threat to pests. I don't have any recommendations, or I'll move past that because I don't have a lot of great recommendations on how to do that other than just doing the research and searching around online or getting recommendations from your fellow gardeners. But I'd say really when you have a pest issue, it's kind of like the term weeds. Weeds are not, there's no plant in nature that's inherently a weed. It's really just something that we don't want. I'd say pests are the same thing. We want living things in our garden. We want bugs and critters in our, we want a living soil in our garden. It's just when things start to get out of balance that we start to look at and see that things are pests, they're a nuisance, that maybe there's too many of those things. Some ways to deal with pests, I'd say, and another thing is pests, a little bit different from nutrient issues, is pests generally, if they're above your soil, and there are pests that are below your soil that kind of give hints that they exist, but pests that are above your soil will usually give a hint that they're around. So you'll start to notice some holes in plants. You'll start to notice kind of like, I don't know, sawdust or like some of the fiber from your plants around the base of the plant. And that's a little evidence that, okay, this isn't a nutrient thing. This is a little bug that's getting into your plants and causing havoc. And so ways to deal with that, I mean, chickens are going to be a great pest control. You might sacrifice some of your vegetables to the chickens, but I think you're getting the benefit of eggs. Possibly you're getting to enjoy the chickens in your yard, and they're going to be doing a lot of pest control in your garden. Another thing is looking for other species that are predators to what you're wanting to get rid of. An easy thing that comes to mind is, I believe, aphids are an issue in a lot of gardens, and ladybugs are a natural predator to aphids. So I've heard of, at some community gardens, they'll purchase large amounts of ladybugs and just release them into the garden, and there'll be some control for the aphid issue, and they're a predator to other pests as well. And all of that is indirectly saying that I really encourage you to do research, try and find solutions to your pest issues before you reach for the pesticide. We want bugs in our garden, and there's, I think, a lot of times other solutions to dealing with pests before you grab the bottle to spray things down. Other things about pests, pests in the soil. You'll have some different kind of soil inhabiting critters that will eat the roots of your vegetables. That's common with some carrots and some of the rooting veggies that, and it's really clear that something is awry once you start to harvest, because you'll pull your carrot, for this example, out of the ground, and it is a very odd shape, or it's just really short and stumpy, or it doesn't look like the carrot you're used to. And so that's a hint that there is something happening under the soil that is wreaking havoc on your root vegetables. And again, I encourage you to do some research and look at what might be the culprit of that. And there are definitely kind of, I'll say, home remedies for addressing those different soil inhabiting pests. So tips for successful gardening. These are just a few things I want to leave you with to help you be a little bit more of a green gardener. I mean, green thumb is always associated with gardeners, but to help you maybe make use of the resources we have at hand before going to the stores to supplement our gardening. Yeah, we'll look at siting your garden, water sources, mulch, and supporting pollinators. And to start, I'll say, kind of circling back to the beginning of the class, think about siting your garden. It's, we want it in a place that's getting some sun exposure. We want to be able to play around with shading or have access to shade, natural shading, maybe with the trees or another building during certain times of the day. But a really big part of gardening is maybe plant where you're going to be walking by often. Are you placing your garden in a place that you're walking by once a day, once a week, once a month? The more often you walk past your garden, the more often you're getting a pulse on how moist is the soil. What is there that's going to be needing to be harvested next week or this week? Are there any pests? Am I noticing any issues with the, something going on above the soil? So really encourage you to plant close to your yard. This is a picture of our outdoor classroom at our Living Lab and Learning Center. This is in Tucson, Arizona. It's our office space, but it's also a demonstration site for rainwater harvesting. And we're open by appointment right now. If you find yourself in Tucson, you can sign up to go on a virtual, an audio tour, so a no contact tour of the space, and learn about all our water harvesting practices on site. And a fun fact is our entire office runs off of, or is, the water is provided by rainwater. So we have a 10,000 gallon tank storing water that water goes to our taps. That water goes to irrigating our, and the back here, these citrus trees, this is our food forest. And then, really it's almost, I'd say 10 months or 11 months of the year that we're running and providing water to our office just with the rain. And I kind of say that because we're growing citrus trees. Those are very thirsty plants. These are dwarf citrus trees. But to get back to the point I want to make, it's that this is our food forest here. So we're producing food in this space. And notice it's right next to our outdoor classroom. So this is a really high traffic area at our office. And we're growing food right next to that so that, people walk by and they'll pick a grapefruit, or they'll pick there's a clementine plant, and there's also a chiltepine plant there. So it's a place that has eyes on it and is traffic by it consistently. So that means that we're harvesting, we're paying attention and noticing things that are happening in our growing space. If you don't have a yard, that's not a problem. Check out your community garden, maybe something near your home, maybe something in your neighborhood. And that is such a great place to grow vegetables because you are surrounded by people that are doing and taking on the same journey as you are. So, wow, you might be gardening next to someone that's been in that plot for 5 years, 10 years, maybe they've gardened there for 20 years. And there's just an abundance of knowledge to get from the people that have been gardening in the same areas that we're living in. Next thing, save your water. Consider hand watering your garden plots or your raised beds. Again, that encourages you to get a pulse on your garden every single time you hand water. You're walking by it, you're seeing what's going on with your gardening space. Another thing, I think for the most part, people know not to water during the daytime. So when it's the sunniest and hottest, and that's to reduce the amount of evaporation. So definitely when you're watering your really any part of your yard, when you're watering anything in the desert, don't water during the daytime. A thing that people, the next step is people start to water in the evening. The disadvantage to watering in the evening, yes, you're reducing some of the evaporation that is happening right away during the hot time of the day, but your plants are really making the most use of water in the soil when they're photosynthesizing. So you want to really water your plants in the morning, early morning, so that the water sinks into the soil, and then once the sun starts to hit their leaves, they're photosynthesizing and they're making use of that that water. Here we have another little picture. This is kind of touching on the rainwater harvesting side of things, but if you remember the slide that the garden was being supported just by rainwater, this is kind of some of the inspiration from that garden. Is you have a sunken bed, and in this example, these are grasses and nothing food producing, but kind of a similar concept where you have a low point in your yard and you can, maybe you don't even need a tank. Maybe you just direct your gutters directly to your vegetable garden. I think a cool part of this picture is it gets to show you some of the different root structures different plants have. In this example, we're looking at a tree, which is not just growing straight down, it's growing outwards. So it's growing, looking for water outwards. Then we have our grasses here that are growing not quite as much outwards, but straight downwards. So it's just a good thing to be aware of, is like our plants are searching for water underneath the soil. That is their life mission. And in addition to reproducing, they're like, where is the water at? So trying to create an environment where their roots are going to be able to grow deep and have access to that deeper water is a great practice. Plant the gray water. So gray water is water from our hand washing sinks, our bathtubs, our showers, and also our laundry machines. And this, someone pointed out, in that slide with the raised or sunken bed and the tank, someone mentioned black water, and so black water is toilet water. It's water from your kitchen sink where you're maybe working with animal products or oils. So water from your kitchen sink and water from your toilet is both considered black water, and we don't want our black water. We want that water going to the sewer, is the simple way to put it. We don't want that water going out to your vegetable garden. You don't want that water going out to your landscape. The black water goes to the sewer. Gray water is that water that's from the hand sinks, bathrooms, hand washing sinks, showers, and laundry machines. This slide here is just to kind of introduce you to, you can irrigate your landscape with gray water. I would not encourage you to irrigate your garden, your vegetable garden, with gray water unless you're taking a lot of things into consideration. Your gray water is a little saltier, so you're adding salts to your vegetable garden, which isn't great. And then it's also, you don't want gray water splashing on the veggies that you're growing and looking forward to consuming. So gray water is a great option if you have citrus trees and are wanting to cut down on your potable irrigation to your citrus or some of the perennial, just some of the food producing trees you have on your property, or to your native landscape. So yes, water conservation, explore gray water. Mulch it. Here we have a picture of mulch. Mulching your garden bed is a great practice to help encourage soil moisture retention. I'd say maybe like an inch or two, probably an inch or two layer, closer to an inch of organic mulch is really beneficial to your garden. I'd say this picture here is mulch from large wood chips. And this is part of it's a rainwater harvesting project. Wood chips are great in basins. Notice we don't have any vegetables growing here. This is really just a basin to be collecting and infiltrating water. And the wood chips are serving as a organic source of nutrients. They're breaking down over time. They're making this maybe a very hard clay, dense soil. They're adding a little bit of organic material and lightening it up. Focusing on vegetable gardens, great organic materials to use as a mulch would be hay, leaf litter, different. I'm not a big fan of using large wood chip mulch in gardens because it encourages it encourages more fungal growth, and your garden wants a little bit more bacterial growth. So yeah, I just encourage using lawn trimmings and hay as a great mulch. What that does is it provides a covering for your soil, which reduces the amount of heat intensity and sun intensity that's hitting your garden during the day. Also, it's helping retain soil moisture in your garden beds. I wouldn't recommend inorganic mulch, so gravel, decomposed granite, and other rocky material in your garden bed. It can be a great mulch for other uses, non-organic mulch, but yeah, I'd say hay and grass clippings are great. Again, start small, start simple. Think about how much food do you need to grow, and yeah, starting small. It's just keeps things light and easy. And then lastly, supporting pollinators. Supporting pollinators doesn't just, well, I guess first of all, looking at this picture, we have our office space in this picture on the left here, and we have this tiny little trough. It's kind of off in the distance. That is growing some greens, and all surrounding that, we have flowering native plants. And so those native plants are attracting native pollinators that are visiting these bright colored flowers here, and then they're making a visit to our garden to maybe pollinate some of our veggies. Yeah, so in general, so I'd say in general, bringing pollinators, native pollinators to your yard, it's benefiting not just your vegetable garden, it's really benefiting our general ecosystem in our Sonoran Desert. So it's not just benefiting us as people, it's benefiting all the other inhabitants of our Sonoran Desert. So I'm looking to the Sonoran Desert for inspiration. I think I'm running probably a little close to overtime. Look for native for native flowering plants. These and possibly harvest those different plants. We have more diversity in kind of, if you're growing native plants, you have more diversity for your local wildlife. And maybe when you're growing native plants, you're not just providing food for yourself, you're also providing food to the other living things in our space. Here I have a picture of Ocotillo, which is kind of that, I imagine some of you have seen it around town. There's the green leaves when it's flowering, and also these wonderful rich flowers here. You can harvest those flowers and make them into a tea. I believe this mixture has Ocotillo, mint, lavender, and there's another native flower in there that I can't remember at the moment. But yeah, look to the Sonoran Desert for inspiration. Again, your native plants aren't just providing food for you, it's providing food to other bugs and species that we want to support. This is a picture of milkweed, which supports the monarch butterfly caterpillar. And here we have really a great picture provided by the city of Glendale, I believe, that is showing a lot of native food producing plants. So I'd love to see if people can identify some of these plants. So use the chat and give a shout out to what you see in this picture. What are some of the edible plants we see in this picture here? I'm going to check and see what people have to say. Okay, prickly pear, yes. Palo Verde, Apuntia, desert huckleberry, yep. Mesquite. Mm-hmm. So these are great, great shout outs. So we have the prickly pear cactus here. This is a great thing to harvest. It has the green pads, which you can eat, nopales. Then it has a fruiting part of the cactus and also a flowering part, and all three parts are edible. Wolfberries are also, they have a really delicious fruit you can add on to, you can dry out and add to your yogurts and different, fruit loving, breakfast foods. We have our mesquite tree that drops mesquite seed pods, and that can be ground up to make your next batch of cookies. And we have a saguaro. This fruits during right after the monsoon season. These fruits are delicious, but saguaro harvesting, you can't harvest saguaro fruit that's on Arizona owned land. So check before you do any harvesting of saguaro fruits. And in general, when you're looking to the desert and looking to our native plants to harvest, don't take all the seeds that you see. Don't take all the fruits that you see. Remember that these fruits are holding the seeds that help these plants, create future generations. These fruits are also what other native species depend on to support themselves. So harvest lightly so that you can share. We're sharing these plants with not just each other, but with a lot of other things that depend on them. So just want to give that little shout out. And with that, I believe, yes, we're all finished. Thanks everyone for sitting through that. And I hope you learned a few things in the presentation. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and kind of break off, and maybe there's some questions that came up, and I'll do my very best to answer those.
Thank you so much, Charlie, for a great presentation. Everyone join me in giving him a virtual round of applause because that was amazing. A lot of great information that was shared tonight, and I love the interaction that I was seeing in the chat. So we did get actually a few questions that rolled in, Charlie. So some of them I answered in the chat to my best of my ability, but there were some that came in. Amy had a question, can a full-grown saguaro be overcrowded by putting plants around them like in the micro sample slide you had? Or is it okay to plant closely around them?
That's a great question. I'd say in general, you can overcrowd your vegetable garden and different plants. With the saguaro, if you're seeing it happen in nature, there's a good chance that everything, it's okay to do. Saguaro, a cool thing about them is that their root structure is incredibly vast. It is, think about the height of your saguaro cactus that you're looking at. The root structure extends out at least as far out as the cactus is tall, but even farther. So crowding around that saguaro cactus, it's not really, its root structure for seeking water is so expansive that you're not running into a situation where it's probably being outcompeted by plants. And so I think I wouldn't ever want to plan to overcrowd things. And like definitely when you're gardening on your landscape, think about the mature size of anything that you're growing. And yeah, don't plan to overcrowd, but I don't think a lot of harm is happening to the saguaro from the overcrowding that we saw in that picture.
Awesome. Thank you, Charlie. Yeah, if it happens in nature, it must be okay, right? Rule of thumb. So Susan also had a question. She says, I harvest rainwater in black trash cans. Am I retaining chemicals from the cans too?
That's a really good point. So I've wondered this a lot myself. I'd say, yes, storing water in plastic containers, and that's rain tanks included, you're probably collecting some small amount of microplastics that are getting into your rainwater. That being said, I'm not aware of rainwater that's stored in a tank adding enough, microplastics or any enough just chemical composition that it prevents plants from taking up water. A big thing with plastics in soils is that it can actually suffocate's not a great word. It can prevent roots from taking up nutrients. And another thing is you can start to see a concern people have is like, well, if it's in the soil, is it making its way into the food that I'm eating? And a lot of times, plants will take up certain things in the soil that we don't want to consume, our vegetable plants, but it'll store it in the leaves and not in the fruiting part. Another thing about the plastic containers, I'd say, yeah, I just haven't run into any like, real issues around it or seen any research that makes it say it's a bad practice. But I think it is a reality of, I mean, goodness, like plastics are everywhere now, which is really unfortunate. Anytime we're washing our clothes, there's plastics in our shirts and our socks that are making their way into the environment. So I struggle with it. It's a thing I really encourage, is to like be aware of the things that we're putting in the environment, and I don't know how to have a resolve with it. I think we're doing good by making use of a resource by collecting the rainwater, and I think we're doing more good than harm in the scenario of storing water in the plastic tanks.
Thank you for that. Yeah, that's always a good concern. So thank you so much for elaborating on that. Thank you. One question we had is, where's your Tucson garden located? I missed the name.
So the 3 gardens I have pictured, one is, so our Living Lab and Learning Center, you can search Watershed Management Group. That was of like the food forest and some of the flowering area in one of the slides. The other 2 pictures I had, there's one of the south-facing picture with a trellis. That's from Tucson Village Farms. And that is another nonprofit in town. They do great work with educating students and empowering people to grow their own food. So Tucson Village Farms is a great organization. The other images were from Las Milpitas Community Garden, and that is it's a garden in town. And yeah, people have been growing there and using that space to grow food for a long time, and some really wonderful people are involved with that garden.
Thank you for that. Awesome. Do we have any more questions? I do want to maybe we have time for one more question if one rolls in, but I do want to be, respectful of your time. But yeah, Charlie, thank you so much for all this information. This was such a great class. I had such an exciting evening to talk about vegetables, and definitely perfect timing for dinner, right? I need to have vegetables for a snack tonight.
Yeah, absolutely. Have some salad or something. Yeah, and thank you, Amani and Anne, who is running the show from behind the scenes, for making this possible. Thanks for everyone for joining. I really hope that you got some inspiration and some ideas for, even if it's starting small, starting something, and starting the journey of growing your own food. So yeah, really appreciate y'all taking the time out of your evenings for that. And thanks, Amani, for being such a great facilitator.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you all for attending tonight. I'll be sending a follow-up email with the PowerPoint resources recording and of course a link to the survey. Remember that if you complete the survey, you'll be entered to win a free gift card from Summer Winds Nursery. Our next workshop in this series is pruning and maintenance of shrubs on Wednesday, February 24th from 5:30 to 7. So that's exactly 2 weeks from today. Same time, same place. We hope you can join us for another exciting evening, and thank you all again for tuning in, and I hope everyone has a great rest of their night, and I hope everyone takes care and stays safe out there.